What is up, guys? Nick Skrip, NFL content lead for Fantrax. Very excited about this episode here today. My guys, the 2024 fantasy football, my guys on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, which is affiliated with the Fantrax brand. We had two podcasts last week. Those are available on both the Fantrax YouTube and on audio platforms, so iTunes and Spotify. If you go to Fantrax, if you go to their YouTube page, you can find the recent episodes there. If you type in P2W Fantasy within iTunes, within Spotify, you can find those episodes as well. I want to get more consistent with plugging these live streams, these podcasts, especially with the season creeping up on us. It's August. We got games in September. I've been plugging content pretty much the entire off season, but now is really crunch time. So you can catch a lot of my content on Twitter at P2W Fantasy. I'm also on Instagram. I'm on TikTok as well. Working tons of stuff for Fantrax. Our team has been grinding this offseason. We have a lot of exciting stuff coming up this season, but we're about to get into this episode here. So go send the link to your buddies and let's get it.
To win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, oh, play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win.
All right, very excited about this episode here today, talking my guys. So the quote-unquote my guys, what does that mean? It typically refers to players that someone is higher on than consensus, or it could be an and/or players that we are trying to get on all of our fantasy football teams. And I can wear both of those hats. As an analyst, I'm higher on these players than what consensus says. And as a fantasy football manager myself, I want these guys on all of my fantasy football teams. So I have a list for each position, guys that I really, really like for fantasy football in 2024 that I do believe take off. So starting off this list with Kyler Murray. I don't know if I've ever been super high in Kyler Murray, but in 2024, I definitely am. QB4 in 2021, QB3 in 2020, QB11 in 2019 in fantasy points per game. He's finished as a top 12 fantasy quarterback in 4 of his 8 games in 2023, and that was following the ACL tear in 2022. Career highs: 3,971 passing yards in 2020, 26 passing touchdowns in 2020, 819 rushing yards in 2020, 11 rushing touchdowns. 2024, you look at the weapons: Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, Zay Jones, James Conner, and Trey Benson. So we're looking at a group that has a lot of good complement pieces, but 2 true alphas for their position in Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride. I think he's one of the best values at the quarterback position right now. Kyler Murray is being drafted as the quarterback 10 and 75th overall for fantasy football. I think he's a guy that can rush for 500 plus yards, and that combination of Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride is going to up the passing. In his first 2 seasons, he passed the ball over 550 times. I think he gets back to that sort of passing volume. And seeing that he's been a top 4 quarterback in points per game, it's hard for me to rank him right now outside of my top 5. So really liking Kyler Murray for 2024. Next guy on the list here, Caleb Williams. And some people will say, well, Nick, you are a Bears fan. It's you just being a Bears homer. And maybe like a little bit of that is accurate, but I am a true believer that Caleb Williams has a great fantasy football season as a rookie. You look at the prospect numbers: 10,082 passing yards, 93 passing touchdowns, 986 rushing yards, 27 rushing touchdowns. The production profile is very much there. And USC had a below average offensive line and really only one noteworthy receiving option that you guys would know if I spit out the name. Elite arm talent by making plays at all 3 levels. The ability to make plays under pressure is there. He's mobile inside the pocket. He breaks off runs when needed. He's solid throwing on the run, makes off-balance plays happen. High football IQ, great vision. Caleb Williams is an overall playmaker through the air and on the ground. And you look at the weapons in 2024: DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett, DeAndre Swift. The first overall pick in the 2024 NFL draft is labeled by many as one of the best quarterback prospects we've seen in a very long time. And then you add him to probably the best situation for a rookie quarterback that I have seen myself. So you add those two things together, and I think he's a bit slept on in redraft this year. I think some people are hesitant when it comes to rookie quarterbacks, but you look at CJ Stroud last season, he had a very impressive fantasy football season as a rookie. And I think Caleb Williams was or is a better prospect than CJ Stroud was. And I think he lands in a much better situation. So it's wheels up for Caleb Williams in 2024 for fantasy football. I think the upside is going to be very, very real. Another guy on my list, unpopular opinion, but Deshaun Watson, top 10 fantasy quarterback in 3 of his 5 full games in 2023. Fantasy scoring from 2020 back to 2018, 23.5 points per game, ranked second, 22 points per game, ranked fifth, 21.3 points per game, ranked fifth. So in his 3 full seasons, Deshaun Watson has been a top 5 quarterback in fantasy points per game. Career highs, 4,823 passing yards in 2020, 33 passing touchdowns in 2020, 551 rushing yards in 2018, 7 rushing touchdowns in 2019. You look at the weapons around him, Amari Cooper, David Njoku, those 2 guys just had very, very good 2023 seasons. I've always been a believer in Jerry Jeudy. I think he can turn it around in Cleveland. Elijah Moore will be a complement piece. Nick Chubb, we're hoping for full health, and Jerome Ford will be there if he's not ready. We once regarded Deshaun Watson as an elite fantasy football quarterback when he was back in Houston. And I think the dual threat statistics support that. The fantasy points per game seasons support that. Joe Flacco is a very different quarterback than Deshaun Watson. But I think that his success last year, not taking anything away from him, is a green flag that the quarterback one can be successful in a very good environment in Cleveland. And I think if Deshaun Watson is fully healthy, we can see a glimpse of what he once was back in those Houston days. Next on the list, Saquon Barkley, 1,312 rushing yards in 2022, 1,307 in 2018. 57, 52, and 91 reception seasons in 2020, 2019, and 2018. 10, 10, and 15 total touchdown seasons, 2023 and 2022, and then back in 2018. Fantasy points per game, 15.9 in 2023, ranked 9th. 17.8 in 2022, ranked 5th. 18.8 in 2019, ranked 7th. 24 in 2018, ranked 3rd. Philadelphia has had 2 running backs the last 2 seasons finish with career highs in rushing yards. DeAndre Swift in 2023, and then Miles Sanders in the year prior, 2022. I think Philadelphia looked at San Francisco's success adding a dynamic playmaking running back in Christian McCaffrey that helped propel them into the Super Bowl, and they thought, hey, how could we mirror that? And they went and tried to do that by adding Saquon Barkley this offseason. I think he explodes in the best situation that he's ever been in. And we, again, once regarded this guy as an elite fantasy football asset, maybe the best, second or third best running back in the NFL. And I think he's the same guy. Health is going to be key here, but I think Saquon Barkley can truly explode in 2024. Sticking with Bears, guys, and maybe I'll get some shit about this later, but DeAndre Swift, career highs, 1,049 rushing yards just this past season in 2023. 5.5 yards per carry was back in 2022. 62 receptions in 2021. 452 receiving yards in 2021. 10 total touchdowns in 2020. He ranked 5th in yards created back in 2021 via Player Profiler. And you look at the fantasy points per game. 12.3 in 2023, ranked 24th. Not super great. But in the years prior, 13.7 in 2022, ranked 15th, 16.1 in 2021, ranked 8th, 14.6 in 2020, ranked 15th. He joins the fastest growing offense in the NFL. We just talked about Caleb Williams before. DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze and Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett make up for a great offense to be the lead back in. We have seen great things out of DeAndre Swift through his career so far. just never put together. I think we've seen glimpses of rushing. I think we've seen glimpses of being a pass catcher. I think we've seen glimpses of touchdown upside. I think we've seen glimpses of fantasy football impacts. And for DeAndre Swift, I think being the lead back is going to mean a lot in this offense. Do I think, he gets all the red zone touches finally? Maybe not. Maybe that's like a Roshan thing. A lot of people will mention Roshan Johnson and Khalil Herbert. I think DeAndre Swift's a far better talent than both of those guys, who probably, can fill in specific roles from time to time. But the Bears went and paid DeAndre Swift. I expect them to utilize him in 2024. Next guy, another maybe unpopular opinion here, but Najee Harris. Love him at cost right now. In 2023, weeks 11 through 18, following the firing of the Steelers' offensive coordinator, Harris ranked 4th in rushing yards with 571 during that span. And during the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 16 through 18, Harris scored the 3rd most fantasy points. He's had 3 straight seasons over 1,000 yards rushing. That's 1,035, 1,038, and 1,200. 74, then 41 receptions in his first 2 seasons. We might not see that sort of receiving upside due to Jaylen Warren, but we know that he's going to be an effective runner on the ground. 2024, you had upgrades to the system. Russell Wilson and Justin Fields for the quarterback room. That's going to be a nice battle there. They added much-needed offensive linemen. They got the guy out of Washington in the first, one out of West Virginia in the second, and then in the 4th round out of South Dakota. So you added 3 offensive linemen to the Steelers, which has been needed since Najee Harris has been a rookie. So again, Jaylen Warren is the big turnoff for Najee Harris. But if we look at how he operated weeks 11 through 18 last season and into the fantasy football playoffs, I think he can keep that stride going, especially being on a contract year. I think you can expect him to continue to be over 1,000 yards rushing. And at the cost of running back 24 in drafts right now, I think he's a guy that can finish within the top 15 potentially. Another guy on my list that's probably not super popular either, and a lot of people are very out on this guy. And I think sometimes, I look at players and sometimes I hit big, where I see the potential in guys. I look at numbers, I look at history, I look at the resume, I look at the opportunity, and I take shots on guys that other people are out on, and I'll hit, man. I will. And then there's other times I do that and I miss, and I'll be accountable either way. If I hit, I'll let you know I hit. And if I miss, I will let you know I miss. Like I'm about that life. But Javonte Williams has been a guy I've been pushing this offseason, especially knowing that everybody seems to be completely out on him. And, it's the Jaleel McLaughlin show, and Audric Estime is the next man up. 6 weeks as a top 24 fantasy running back in 2023 and caught 47 balls after tearing his ACL in 2022. 2021, the rookie season, when we flash back to that, 903 rushing yards, 7 touchdowns, 4 weeks as a top 10 fantasy running back, 3 weeks scoring over 20 fantasy points. He ranked 6th via Player Profiler in both evaded tackles and yards created. He finished 22nd in fantasy points per game, not being the full-time starter the entire year. People have been fading him this entire offseason, though, because he didn't explode last year following an ACL tear the year prior. I think people need to understand that Breece Hall, exploding for fantasy football last year after he tore his ACL the year prior, he's the asterisk, not Javonte Williams. It's not very common for a guy to tear his ACL, then come back the very next season and just ball out. But we saw little glimpses of him still doing some good things and even catching some quality pass numbers there in 2023. I think he's the only guy in the roster that actually profiles as a true running back one. I think he's got the build of a workhorse running back in this league. I think he's a guy that is a very effective runner. We saw that his rookie season. I think Jaleel McLaughlin serves as a pass catching option that can spell Javonte. I think Audric Estime, I liked him a lot as a prospect. I think he's the future of the Broncos, but the now is very much Javonte Williams. And I think for a guy that can touch the ball 200 to 250 times in 2024, if he commands that starting role, the cost of running back 34 just doesn't make sense. All right. So I'm talking Jamar Chase here. And the reason I'm going to talk about Jamar Chase, and people will say, like, oh, what a hot take that he's one of your guys. The reason I'm talking about Jamar Chase is not just because he's one of my guys on this list. It's not just because I have him ranked as the wide receiver 1 for fantasy football this year. It's because I think he's the 101 of fantasy football this year. I think Jamar Chase is the 101 of fantasy football this year, and here's why. 2021, aka the only season, is rookie season, that both Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow played a full season. Chase finished with 1,455 receiving yards, 13 receiving touchdowns, and 17.9 fantasy points per game, which ranked 5th. I dove into the 38 games that Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow have actually played together across the last seasons in the NFL. And here's the averages: 9.58 targets, 6.24 receptions, 87.05 receiving yards, 13.82 yards per catch, 0.74 receiving touchdowns. That stands out. That one stands out a ton. And 19.27 fantasy points. Percentage of games here: 8 out of 38 games with 10 plus targets, 13 out of 38 games with 100 plus receiving yards, 20 out of 38 games with a receiving touchdown, 15 out of 38 games with 20 plus fantasy points. Upside notes: 6 games with multiple receiving touchdowns in his career, 2 games with 3 receiving touchdowns, 10 games with 120 plus receiving yards, 4 games with 150 plus receiving yards, 2 games with 200 plus receiving yards, 11 games with 25 plus fantasy points, 5 games with 30 plus fantasy points, and 2 games with 50 plus fantasy points. I think that a healthy Jamar Chase with a healthy Joe Burrow has the highest ceiling of any wide receiver for fantasy football heading into 2024. The LSU turned Cincinnati connection is very, very real. Jamar Chase can lead the league in receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. He's a beast when it comes to being targeted in the red zone, and I think he's just a guy that does a ton and everything that any other wide receiver can do with the ball in his hands. I truly think that Jamar Chase, with a full season of Joe Burrow, can break fantasy football this season. Up next, we have Drake London. 2022, he was the NFL's wide receiver 1 at pick 8. He had the 5th highest target share in the NFL that season via Player Profiler, 29.4%, 117 targets that season. He's had a mixture of Desmond Ridder, Taylor Heineke, Marcus Mariota, a lack of passing volume. Atlanta's ranked 8th least in passing attempts in 2023 and 2nd least in 2022. They had a coaching staff that didn't emphasize the playmakers at all. I think London has been set up to fail. And, you hold expectations high for guys that are supposed to be good. But at the same time, when the quarterback plays bad, the coaching's bad, and the volume's not there, it's tough, man. But 4-year contract for Kirk Cousins, $180 million, that was a good sign. That was a good sign that things are going to change when it came to the quarterback room. And I think drafting Michael Penix Jr. out of Washington, who's a gunslinger, was great for Drake London as well. I think that was an insurance move for Atlanta. Cousins is coming off of an Achilles tear, and he's not a young guy anymore. So I think having both Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix Jr. insulates Drake London moving forward. Arthur Smith fired. That's a good thing. In 2023, when targeted 8+ times, here's a glimpse: 18.7 fantasy points in week 2, 14.7 fantasy points in week 5, 21.5 fantasy points in week 6, 29.2 fantasy points in week 14, and then 9.6 fantasy points, I think, to end the season there. But majority of the time there, Drake London, very good when targeted. I think he's one of the biggest winners of the offseason. I think Kirk Cousins, you bring him in, it means a couple things. It means more passing volume, and the quality of the targets coming London's way improves. I think London's got the DNA of like a Mike Evans sort of wide receiver. I think he can finally be over 1,000 receiving yards in 2024, and I think he can have some touchdown upside. So I'm very in on Drake London, and people say he's never really done anything. Context always matters. Zay Flowers led the Ravens in targets with 108, receptions with 77, and receiving yards with 858 by the end of his rookie season. Mark Andrews did suffer an injury that cut his season short, but Zay did out-target Andrews on a per-game basis, 6.8 to 6.1. He finished 15th in yards after the catch. And here's some of the fantasy football finishes. 17.1 points in week 1, 17.1 points in week 6, 23.2 in week 12, 20 in week 14, 22.2 in week 16, and 19.6 in week 17. Then you look at the NFL playoffs. He caught 9 of his 13 targets for 156 receiving yards and a touchdown. He accounted for 23.63% of the team's targets, 25% of the team's receptions, and 36.79% of the team's receiving yards. So that just shows how important Zay Flowers was to the Ravens in the playoffs. I look at this guy and say, hey, he came in, he did his thing. It wasn't like he was a Puka Nacua, to that extent, but he was very fantasy relevant as a rookie. I think the fact that he ended the season across the last 5 weeks so hot, and then that carried into the NFL playoffs, speaks numbers to me about Zay Flowers. I think that this is a guy that can continue on that upward trend heading into his sophomore season. And this was a good year out of Lamar Jackson through the year. He had career highs in passing attempts and passing yards. And I think, you look at Baltimore and you see they added Derrick Henry, and Lamar Jackson still led the league in rushing. The numbers are going up through the air, and Zay Flowers put his stamp on this Ravens offense as a rookie. I think year 2 could be a big leap in fantasy production, and I would definitely take the shot at wide receiver 25, which is his current ADP. Another sophomore I like is Jayden Reed from the Packers. And see, I talked about the Bears a lot earlier, and now I'm talking about some Packers guys here. But second-round selection by Green Bay in 2024. Rookie campaign, he finished tied for first in targets per game, led Green Bay in receiving yards with 793, and he led the receiving room in total touchdowns with 10. For the position, Reed finished 16th in slot snaps, number 27 in yards after the catch, number 27 in yards per route run, number 3 in rushing yards, interesting, and number 26 in fantasy points per game at 13.6. Jordan Love finally had a shot as a starter, had a very good season, 4,159 passing yards and 32 passing touchdowns. He got paid a lot of money this offseason. I think he his season is very encouraging for the pass catchers in Green Bay. A lot of people have juggled, who's the wide receiver 1 in Green Bay. I think this guy, Romeo Doubs was good in the playoffs. Christian Watson's got a lot of upside. Dontavian Wicks' efficiency numbers are crazy when you look at his yards per steps to the left and, forward and back and left and right and whatever you want to say about Wicks. But I think it's very clear Reed was the most productive for fantasy football in 2023 as a rookie. I think it's very clear he had a connection with Jordan Love instantly, right? Just looking at the grand scheme of the season. I think it's very clear he's the most dynamic wide receiver on the roster, Jayden Reed. I think it's very clear that when it comes to versatility and when it comes to, being on the field and finding ways to impact the offense, it's Jayden Reed. The guy can line up in the slot. The guy can line up out wide. He can run the ball. So I think Reed is the best playmaking wide receiver in Green Bay. And I think it translated very well for fantasy football. And I think it will continue to, because why would it not when it did in his rookie season? Deontay Johnson, 147 targets in 2022, 169 in 2021, 144 in 2020. That's back when he was with the Steelers. 1,161 receiving yards and 8 receiving touchdowns in 2021. 17.2, which ranked 8th fantasy points per game in 2021, and 14.8, which ranked 22nd in 2020. And then he lands in Carolina this offseason, 2 years, $36.7 million, the contract. Carolina's made several moves this offseason. They hired Dave Canales to be their head coach, who's had a history of boosting quarterbacks. You look at Russell Wilson's 2018 leap in Seattle, Geno Smith's major career turnaround also in Seattle in 2022, the bounce back season for Baker Mayfield last year in Tampa Bay. Carolina signed guards Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis to add to their offensive line. Added weapons in Xavier Legette via the first round. Jonathan Brooks in the second round. Jatavian Sanders in the fourth round. I think Bryce Young can take a step forward in 2024. I think that one thing not enough people talk about is that Adam Thielen was very, very relevant, even with Bryce Young struggling as a rookie for fantasy football. I think that Deontay Johnson is the clear-cut wide receiver one now in 2024. I think Thielen still plays a role, but when it comes to a guy that just simply earns targets consistently, runs the right routes, is just great at getting open, that's Deontay Johnson. He's been that guy, and I think he's going to be that guy for Bryce Young. So now that Carolina's offense is taking a step in the right direction, coaching staff's better. Bryce Young has more supporting weapons and also guys in front of him protecting him. I think you saw a great season out of Adam Thielen for a good chunk of 2023. Now it's Deontay Johnson, who I have a lot of faith in as a talent, and I love the situation. He's a guy that can see 130-plus targets, and he's priced right now as the wide receiver 38 in fantasy football drafts. Ladd McConkey, 1,687 receiving yards and 14 touchdowns produced out of Georgia. Second-round selection by the Chargers in 2024. You couldn't ask for a better landing spot for a rookie. Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Austin Eckler, and Gerald Everett are all out of Los Angeles. So that's an empty wide receiver room for the most part. I do like Joshua Palmer. I think he's a good sleeper at cost. But when it comes to vacated targets, and somebody said to me, recently, they're not vacated because the coaching staff's different. It's Harbaugh now. It's still vacated, dude. At the end of the day, it's the same quarterback. Even if his volume changes, there's still a lot of guys that used to catch the ball that are not catching the ball anymore. So that's like 2+2 sort of thing. And Ladd McConkey can enter that wide receiver room with Justin Herbert, who averaged 35.1 passing attempts per game in 2023, and be an impact. I mean, Herbert has had a season over 5,000 passing yards and 38 passing touchdowns back in 2021. So he's got a pretty nice ceiling through the air. And I think Ladd McConkey, he's a very athletic slot wide receiver, ran a 4.39 40. So he's not just like your typical, short route guy that, slips through the defense and maybe is not explosive. Like he could probably he could stretch the field with his speed. And I think we've been seeing clips from camp that shows he can get downfield. He's not just like a, super low ADOT sort of wide receiver. So I wasn't in love with his production profile out of Georgia, in all honesty. But I think he has a lot of the intangibles, Ladd McConkey. I think that he does the right things, makes the right plays. I think he could be the number one target for Justin Herbert, which would have massive fantasy football implications. And the wide receiver 42 price tag right now is hard to pass on when it comes to those factors. Speaking of slot wide receivers, Jackson Smith and Jigba. A lot of people forget that JSN outproduced both Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave at Ohio State back in 2021. First-round selection by Seattle in 2023. He earned 93 targets with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett on the field as a rookie. Finished 21st in yards after the catch, despite ranking 95th in the depth of his targets. 6 weeks scoring 12-plus fantasy points in 2023. He had weeks of 16.3 points in week 7 and 14.8 in week 15. I think he gets overlooked because he didn't completely kick out DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett from relevance as a rookie. Like that was expected or something. No other rookies last season had the target competition that JSN did, and he almost earned 100 targets still in a season that Geno Smith did not look very good. I do believe that JSN can become the number 1 or 2 target in Seattle in 2024. I think he is that talented at the end of the day. I think he is potentially one of the next dominant slot wide receivers for fantasy football. The change in coaching hopefully will elevate the quarterback play of Geno, or it's going to end up being Sam Howell if it doesn't. Wide receiver 45, I'm very in on that cost for JSN. Just buying into the talent, buying into the good signs from his rookie season. It's okay that he didn't have a massive season. just seeing that he has some positive notes and just seeing that the skill set and the opportunity is still there to grow. Brian Thomas Jr. led the FBS in receiving touchdowns with 17. He posted a breakout 1,177 receiving yard season with Malik Nabers out there with him. Vertical threat with scoring upside, first round capital in the NFL draft, and he landed in a nice spot, especially seeing that, Calvin Ridley vacated 136 targets. We do have Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram as the primary options for Trevor Lawrence that Brian Thomas Jr. will compete for with targets. But when we look at the trio of Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram and Gabe Davis, maybe even Parker Washington, I think they are complement pieces in an offense. I don't think any of those guys are like true alphas of an offense. And no disrespect to Evan Ingram in the season he had last year, but I just think they're better off as complement pieces. I think Jacksonville looked at Trevor Lawrence's 21 and 25 touchdowns the last 2 seasons and thought, hey, we can really use someone who can score touchdowns to elevate our quarterback. So now you insert the guy that just scored the most receiving touchdowns in college football last season into the mix. And you have a guy that could potentially be the team's wide receiver 1. I don't know if that's his rookie season or if it's in the future, but when you look at the build of Brian Thomas, big wide receiver who can make some big plays and score touchdowns, that's what he can offer Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars. So at the price tag of wide receiver 49 for an upside dart throw, I'm in on Brian Thomas Jr., who Jacksonville liked enough to take in the first round, and I think can have that touchdown upside in the NFL. Probably my favorite rookie to talk about, just because I feel like he's very, very slept on. And I think that he's a guy that can be an impactful wide receiver straight away. Jalen Polk of the Patriots, 1,159 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns in Polk's final college season at Washington with Malik Nabers on the field. Whoop, that's not Malik Nabers. With Rome Odunze on the field. Let me go back there. I'm mixing the two guys together. So Jalen Polk, 1,159 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns, final season at Washington with Rome Odunze, Chicago Bear, on the field. Second round selection by the Patriots in 2024, which was the first move that they made after they selected Drake May in the first round. Polk is the only guy, in my opinion, on the Patriots roster who profiles as a true wide receiver 1. And I think he will operate as that in 2024. The guy gets up and makes the big plays. He fights for the ball. He commits to blocking. He's smoking camp right now. I think there's the chance that he has weekly target volume, and that paired with some upside we've seen in his prospect profile can end up being, a weekly flex option for fantasy football managers. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 68 right now for a guy that can be a team's wide receiver 1, and he looks great in camp. And I think he's going to have a huge role for the Patriots instantly as a rookie. Trey McBride. So we're getting into tight ends. Trey McBride. 2023, weeks 8 through 17, when taking over as the starting tight end, McBride ranked number 3 in targets, number 2 in receptions, number 3 in receiving yards, number 3 in fantasy points scored, and he averaged 15 fantasy points per game. And here's some upside examples from 2023. 25.5 fantasy points week 8, 21.1 fantasy points week 10, 22.9 fantasy points in week 13, 20.2 fantasy points in week 15. He had 131 receiving yards in week 10, 10 receptions in week 8. A lot of upside examples for Trey McBride. Your tight end for fantasy football is not supposed to score over 20 fantasy points at the rate Trey McBride did when he was actually starting. The Kyler Murray connection looked great, and that was Kyler only playing 8 games after tearing his ACL the year prior. He heavily targeted McBride. And for me, when he was on the field with Kyler, he had just as much upside as any other tight end for fantasy football in the NFL. And a lot of people will mention rookie Marvin Harrison Jr. potentially limiting McBride in 2024. But I just simply referenced last season Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta. Will Kyler Murray throw the ball the same amount of times as Jared Goff? No, but he did have 2 seasons in his opening 2 seasons over 550 attempts. And I think he gets back to that sort of volume now that he has that combination of Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride and the complement pieces that they have in that offense. So Trey McBride right now is my wide receiver, plays like a wide receiver, my tight end 1 for fantasy football. I loved his prospect profile. If you look at his final college season, he had a wildly productive season, like a season that most wide receivers don't have. And he showed that he can be that elite pass catcher in the NFL this past season. And I think a full season of Trey McBride is going to be a lot of upside. All right, Dalton Kincaid, 2023 first-round selection by the Bills. He finished the season number 23 in snap share at 65.6%. And the reason I plugged that is because he was fairly productive while not being, a top 20 tight end in snap share. Number 8 in targets, 91. Number 7 in receptions, 73. Number 10 in receiving yards, 673. Number 14 in fantasy points per game, 9.4. He ran the second most slot snaps for the position. Kincaid was on fire weeks 7 through 12, where he ranked number 4 in targets, number 2 in receptions, number 5 in receiving yards, number 3 in total fantasy points, and he averaged 14.1 fantasy points per game. Stephon Diggs vacates 160 targets after his move to the Texans. Second-round rookie Keon Coleman, newcomer Curtis Samuel, and slot wide receiver Khalil Shakir will be the primary target competitions for Dalton Kincaid. But I think that all of these wide receivers have potential to be good. But again, I don't know if any of those guys are a true number 1. I think there's a very real chance that Dalton Kincaid is Josh Allen's number 1 target in 2024. And if Kincaid is Josh Allen's number 1 target in 2024, I think he has tight end 1 overall upside. We're talking about, Josh Allen, who's passed for over 4,300 yards for 4 straight seasons and has thrown 35 plus touchdowns in 3 seasons through his career. So if Kincaid can be that number 1 target, we're looking at the next, like Travis Kelce. I'm not going to say he's going to be as good as Travis Kelce, but we're talking about a tight end that becomes the number 1 target for a very, very good quarterback in Josh Allen. So that would have huge fantasy football implications for this coming season. The last guy on my list is Pat Freiermuth. So we look back to 2022. Here's some notes. 9.3 fantasy points per game, ranked 12th. 98 targets, ranked 5th. 12 deep targets, ranked 3rd. 63 receptions, ranked 6th. 732 receiving yards, ranked 6th. 1.86 yards per route run, ranked 7th. 286 yards after the catch, ranked 9th. He led all tight ends in 2021 as a rookie in red zone targets, and he scored 7 touchdowns that season. So we've seen very, very good check boxes marked in 2022, and then he had a lot of touchdown upside in 2021. And then we look at 2024, you have not 1 but 2 quarterback upgrades in Pittsburgh with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. That was a huge step forward. Then we have the selections of 3 offensive linemen in the 2024 NFL draft in the 1st, 2nd, and 4th rounds. Big for the Steelers. They've needed this for a while. The team's perceived wide receiver 1, Deontay Johnson, who we talked about earlier, is now a Carolina Panther. Roman Wilson was selected in the 3rd round of the NFL draft this year. Should take on the wide receiver 2 role. It could be Van Jefferson, but George Pickens defaults as the wide receiver 1. I think that this means that Pat Freiermuth is the target number 2, which he was in 2022. So now we're looking at a guy who has an offense that is reshaped with quarterback and offensive line. You lose a wide receiver, you have guys step up in the depth chart. I think we are going to see consistent target volume for Pat Freiermuth, who had a very, very good 2022 season, and he's had touchdown upside in his rookie year. I think that, at the cost of where he's going, tight end 15 in fantasy football drafts, he is one of your punt the tight end position targets, and I think he's going to truly pay off for fantasy football in 2024. That'll do it for the stream. There's obviously a lot of guys that I like and may consider as my guys, quote unquote, in 2024, but I wanted to talk about these guys here I'm actively trying to draft them myself in my fantasy football redraft leagues. I'm trying to trade for them or roster them in general in dynasty leagues as well. I have a lot of faith in these guys. I'm higher on these guys than consensus. And I think a lot of these guys in this list are guys you should consider drafting or rostering for fantasy football in 2024 that can give you an edge in your league, either as like quote unquote league winners or guys that will simply smash their ADP. Be sure that you are following me on Twitter or X at P2W Fantasy. You can find my work on TikTok and Instagram as well. Be sure to follow the Fantrax pages as well. This will be on the Fantrax YouTube channel, which you should subscribe to. I have tons and tons of video content on there. Just loving the grind this season. I think the Fantrax brand itself has truly elevated as a fantasy football team. We have so many great creators, and we have guys that are putting in a ton of work and busting their ass. I really love leading this team. I love the members of it. So be sure to check out their work on the Fantrax website, YouTube channel, Twitter, etc. Thank you guys for tuning in, and be sure to tune in for the next episode, probably next week. Have a good night, guys.